Before any kingdom rose in Egypt, before the first stones were laid at Troy, a city of 40,000 souls already thrived in the marshlands of southern Iraq. Its scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay, recording the world's first written words. Its priests climbed stepped platforms to meet their gods. Its bureaucrats distributed bread and beer to thousands of laborers using mass-produced bowls. This was Uruk, and it was only the beginning of a story that would span 5,000 years, produce history's first empire, first law code, first epic poem, and first astronomical predictions, all in the same narrow floodplain between two rivers. What follows is the complete journey. From Neolithic farmers descending out of the Zagros foothills onto an untamed alluvial plain, through the rise of Sumerian city-states warring over canal water and divine favor, through Sargon of Akkad's shattering conquest, through the bureaucratic brilliance of the third dynasty of Ur, through Hammurabi's Babylon and the iron terror of Assyria, through the burning of Nineveh and the golden gates of Nebuchadnezzar, all the way to the last cuneiform tablet, scratched in the 1st century of the Common Era. This is not a fragment. This is the full life of humanity's first experiment in civilization, from its first breath to its quiet end. Every hour measured in 60 minutes, every circle divided into 360 degrees, every legal code that governs a modern nation traces a thread back to this land. The very idea that strangers can live together in cities bound by written law rather than kinship alone was born here. If you find meaning in complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, consider subscribing. Each week we walk the full arc of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where all of it began, with the mud, the reeds, and the river. Before the first city, before the first written sign pressed into wet clay, before kingship or temple or wall, there is only the land itself. A crescent of green arcs from the Jordan Valley northward through the foothills of southeastern Anatolia, then curves south and east along the flanks of the Zagros Mountains. Rain falls here in winter, enough to sustain wild grasses whose seeds will change the course of human history. Emmer wheat and einkorn grow on rocky slopes. Wild barley ripens in dense stands. Herds of wild goats and sheep move through upland valleys, where oak and pistachio woodland thins into open grassland. Around 10,000 years before the Common Era, in these same foothills, small bands of hunters and foragers begin to stay. Not all at once, not in a single generation, but across centuries of imperceptible change, people return to the same campsites, harvest the same grain stands, and eventually scatter seeds deliberately near their shelters. The shift is not dramatic. It is the slowest revolution in human experience, the transition from following food to growing it. By 7,000 years before the Common Era, the village of Jarmo sits in the Zagros foothills of what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. Perhaps 150 people live here in mud-brick houses with reed-matted roofs. They cultivate barley and wheat, keep domesticated goats, and store surplus grain in clay-lined bins. Their tools are ground stone, mortars, pestles, sickle blades of chipped flint, set in bitumen along curved bone handles. Jarmo is not unique. Dozens of similar settlements dot the Piedmont zone from the upper Tigris to the central Zagros. Farther west and south, Tel Hassuna emerges around 6,500 years before the Common Era on the rain-fed steppe below the Sinjar Hills. Its houses are larger, its pottery finer. buff-colored vessels painted with geometric patterns in red and brown. Storage jars grow bigger, communities grow denser. The Hassuna culture spreads across the northern Mesopotamian plain wherever rainfall exceeds 200 millimeters per year, the minimum for dry farming. Then something extraordinary appears. The Halaf culture, flourishing from roughly 6,000 to 5,400 years before the Common Era, produces some of the most beautiful painted ceramics of the ancient world. Polychrome vessels decorated with intricate geometric and animal motifs, fired at high temperatures in purpose-built kilns. Halaf settlements feature distinctive circular buildings called tholoi, their domed roofs spanning several meters. These communities trade obsidian from Anatolian volcanoes and share artistic styles across hundreds of kilometers, from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau. But the true transformation begins when people descend from the foothills onto the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, a landscape of a fundamentally different character. Here, rainfall is negligible. The rivers flood unpredictably. There is no stone, no timber, no metal. There is only clay, water, reeds, and date palms. Survival demands irrigation, the deliberate channeling of river water onto fields through hand-dug canals. At Eridu, near the marshy shores of what was then a freshwater lagoon close to the Persian Gulf, the Ubaid culture takes root around 5,400 years before the Common Era. Excavations reveal a sequence of 17 temples built one atop another on the same sacred spot, each slightly larger, each more elaborate than the last. The earliest is a simple room with an offering table and a niche. The latest approaches monumental scale. This continuity of sacred architecture across more than 1,000 years reveals something profound. A community bound not merely by kinship or subsistence, but by shared devotion to a place, a deity, a tradition maintained across generations. The Ubaid period, spanning roughly from 5,400 to 4,000 years before the Common Era, transforms southern Mesopotamia. Large-scale canal systems allow farming on the rich but rainless alluvial soil. Surplus grain concentrates in temple storerooms. Burial goods begin to differentiate the wealthy from the poor. Some graves contain painted pottery and stone beads, others almost nothing. Social hierarchy crystallizes. Ubaid-style pottery and architectural forms spread remarkably far, across the Arabian Gulf coast, into the highlands, northward to replace the Halaf tradition. A cultural template is emerging. Temple at the center, irrigated fields radiating outward, surplus managed by emerging elites. The plain demands cooperation on a scale the foothills never required. From this demand, something unprecedented will grow. Something unprecedented does grow. By 4,000 years before the Common Era, the settlement at Uruk, already ancient, already layered upon generations of Ubaid occupation, begins to pull the surrounding landscape into its orbit with a gravitational force no human community has ever before exerted. Villages that once stood independent now feed their surplus toward this single point on the lower Euphrates, where the river bends through flat marshland and date palm groves stretch to the horizon. Within 9 centuries, Uruk will become the largest concentration of human beings the world has ever seen. The scale defies anything the Ubaid period imagined. By 3,100 years before the Common Era, the city covers approximately 250 hectares. A vast expanse of mud brick houses, workshops, courtyards, canal-fed gardens, and monumental sacred precincts, all enclosed within a wall stretching 6 kilometers. Perhaps 40,000 people live within, or immediately around these walls. Nothing comparable exists anywhere on Earth. The next largest settlements are small towns by comparison. 2 great sacred complexes dominate the city's core. The Inanna precinct, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, contains a sequence of monumental buildings constructed not from the usual mud brick, but from imported limestone, a material hauled from quarries 60 kilometers distant. Mosaic columns studded with thousands of painted clay cones in red, white, and black patterns line the walls of courtyards and halls. The labor required to produce these buildings implies a commanding authority capable of mobilizing hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers for sustained periods. Nearby, on the Anu Ziggurat, the White Temple sits atop a raised platform, small, pristine, its walls coated in white gypsum plaster, visible from across the flat plain like a beacon. Who governs this unprecedented experiment remains uncertain. Later Sumerian tradition speaks of the Een, a figure combining priestly and political authority, mediating between the human community and the divine. The Waka vase, carved around 3,200 years before the Common Era, offers a visual clue. Its registers show a procession of naked men bearing agricultural offerings upward through bands of cultivated grain and domesticated animals, culminating in a scene where a robed figure receives gifts before the symbols of Inanna. Authority here is inseparable from ritual, from the cycle of harvest and offering. The administrative demands of this city generate humanity's most consequential invention. For centuries, small clay tokens sealed inside hollow clay balls, bullae, have tracked commodities in transit. But by 3,300 years before the Common Era, in Uruk Level 4, scribes begin pressing wedge-shaped marks into flat clay tablets. These proto-cuneiform signs, over 700 distinct symbols, record quantities of grain, livestock, textiles, and labor obligations. They are not yet language in the full sense. They are accounting. But they are writing, and nothing that follows in human intellectual history is possible without them. The beveled rim bowl tells another story of scale. These crude, mass-produced vessels, identical in size, undecorated, found by the tens of thousands, appear to be standardized ration containers. Someone is feeding a labor force in measured portions. The temple, the palace, or whatever institution commands Uruk's center distributes bread and beer to workers who build its walls, dig its canals, and haul its limestone. Uruk's influence radiates outward in what scholars call the Uruk expansion. Colonies and trading outposts carrying southern Mesopotamian material culture appear across Upper Mesopotamia, into Syria at Habuba Kabira, and into southeastern Anatolia at Hassanebi. Beveled rim bowls, numerical tablets, and characteristic architecture appear hundreds of kilometers from the mother city. Whether this represents colonization, trade networks, or cultural emulation remains debated, but the pattern is unmistakable. Southern Mesopotamian urban culture is projecting itself across the ancient Near East. Then, around 3,100 years before the Common Era, the expansion contracts. The distant colonies are abandoned or destroyed. Uruk itself continues, but the network collapses. The reasons remain obscure, perhaps overextension, perhaps resistance from local populations, perhaps climatic shifts. What endures is the city itself and the technologies it has birthed: writing, Monumental architecture, mass production, bureaucratic administration, and the social stratification that makes all of these possible. The world's first city has set a template that will never be unlearned. The plain between the rivers does not remain unified under a single vision. As the Uruk network dissolves and the fourth millennium gives way to the third, the alluvial south fractures into a constellation of independent cities, each rising from its own mound of accumulated centuries, each claiming divine sanction for its own dynasty. This is the early dynastic period, roughly 800 years during which southern Mesopotamia becomes a laboratory for competitive statecraft, sacred warfare, and the crystallization of kingship as an institution. The Sumerian king list, composed centuries later but drawing on older traditions, frames this era with a single mythic assertion: kingship descended from heaven. It alights first at Eridu, then passes from city to city, Kish, Uruk, Lagash, as though sovereignty were a flame carried by successive hands. The reality is messier. Multiple cities hold power simultaneously. Kish in the north and Uruk in the south both claim hegemony. The title King of Kish becomes an honorific implying dominion over the entire land, adopted even by rulers of distant cities. Gilgamesh, remembered in later epic as a demigod who sought immortality, rules Uruk around 2700 before the Common Era as a historical king, a builder of walls, a war leader whose name appears on contemporary inscriptions. Each city-state centers on its patron deity's temple estate. Ningirsu protects Lagash. Inanna claims Uruk. Nanna illuminates Ur. The temple is not merely a place of worship, but an economic engine, owning vast tracts of irrigated land, employing hundreds of laborers, managing herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, distributing rations of barley and oil. The Ensi, the city ruler, governs as the deity's steward on earth, mediating between divine will and human need. But the gods' estates share borders, and borders breed conflict. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma over the Guadena, a fertile tract of canal-fed land on their mutual frontier, persists for generations. Around 2450 before the Common Era, Eannatum of Lagash commemorates his victory on the Stele of the Vultures, limestone carved with marching phalanxes of soldiers behind interlocked shields, vultures carrying away the heads of the slain. This is organized warfare, disciplined infantry, coordinated formations, siege operations against walled cities. The Stele records a boundary treaty sworn before the gods, yet within decades the conflict reignites. At around 2600 before the Common Era, the royal cemetery reveals a society of staggering wealth and disturbing ritual. Queen Puabi descends into her tomb wearing a headdress of gold leaves, ribbons of lapis lazuli and carnelian beads, gold crescent earrings. Around her lie attendants, dozens of men and women in court dress, soldiers with copper weapons, ox-drawn sledges, lyres decorated with gold and shell inlay. They have taken poison willingly or otherwise, accompanying their sovereign into death. The standard of found in another grave, depicts on one face a banquet with musicians and drinking scenes, on the other a military campaign with four-wheeled war carts trampling enemies. Peace and war, the twin poles of early dynastic existence, rendered in shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli set in bitumen. Trade networks stretch far to supply these luxuries. Lapis lazuli arrives from Badakhshan in distant Afghanistan. Carnelian comes from the Indus Valley. Copper flows from Oman, timber from Lebanon. The Gulf trade route connects to Dilmun, Magan and Meluha, Bahrain, Oman, and the Harappan civilization. Mesopotamia exports textiles, grain, and finished goods. It imports everything the alluvial plain cannot provide: stone, metal, wood. By 2340 before the Common Era, the system of competing city-states reaches a breaking point. Lugal-Zagizi of Umma conquers Lagash, then Uruk, then claims dominion over all of Sumer from the lower sea to the upper sea. For a brief moment, one ruler holds what generations of kings have fought over. But his unification is fragile, achieved through force without new administrative structures to sustain it. The land of Sumer stands poised, its cities wealthy, its armies hardened, its scribes recording every transaction, waiting for someone to forge these fractious polities into something the world has never seen. He comes from nowhere, or so the legends insist. Later tradition holds that his mother was a priestess who set him adrift in a basket of rushes on the Euphrates, that a gardener drew him from the water, that the goddess Ishtar loved him. His very name, Sharukin, means "the king is legitimate," a declaration that protests too much, suggesting origins outside any recognized dynasty. What matters is what he does. Around 2334 before the Common Era, this man who calls himself Sargon seizes power in the city of Kish, in the northern reaches of the alluvial plain where Akkadian-speaking Semitic populations have long lived alongside Sumerian communities. From Kish, he moves south with devastating speed. Lugal-Zagizi, who had claimed lordship over all Sumer, falls. Sargon captures him, brings him in a neckstock to the gate of Enlil's temple at Nippur, a ritual humiliation before the god who grants kingship. Then, city by city, the old order crumbles. Uruk, Lagash, Umma, each submits or is taken by force. Sargon tears down the walls of conquered cities, eliminating their capacity for independent defense. He washes his weapons in the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, claiming dominion over the entirety of southern Mesopotamia in a single campaign season. But he does not stop. This is what separates Sargon from every ruler before him. Where Lugal-Zagizi claimed symbolic authority over distant lands, Sargon marches armies into them. He campaigns northwest along the Euphrates into Syria, reaching the cedar forest, likely the Amanus Mountains, and the Silver Mountains of Anatolia. He crosses eastward into Elam. His inscriptions claim that ships from Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha dock at his capital's quay. The geography of his ambition encompasses the entire known world of the ancient Near East, from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau, from the mountains of southeastern Turkey to the shores of the Gulf. The capital he builds, Akkad or Agade, becomes the wealthiest city in the world. Its location has never been found, despite more than a century of searching. It lies somewhere in the northern alluvial plain, perhaps beneath modern Baghdad or its environs, buried under millennia of river silt. From this invisible city, Sargon rules for approximately 55 years, establishing a dynasty that will endure for over a century. The empire he creates requires new mechanisms of control. Sargon installs his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon, god Nana, at Ur, the first author in history whose name is known, composing hymns in Sumerian that fuse religious authority with political loyalty. He appoints Akkadian-speaking governors over Sumerian cities, creating a bilingual administrative class. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue related to later Hebrew and Arabic, rises to become the language of royal inscriptions and increasingly of administration. though Sumerian persists in religious and literary contexts. His armies are organized differently from the citizen militias of the city-states. Later texts claim he fed 5,400 soldiers daily at his table, a standing professional force loyal to the king rather than to any city. These soldiers carry composite bows, bronze-tipped spears, and axes. They campaign across distances no Sumerian army had previously covered, sustained by supply lines and garrison posts rather than seasonal raiding. Revolts flare constantly. The Sumerian cities chafe under foreign rule. Sargon's own inscriptions acknowledge that he suppressed rebellions in his old age, that the elders of his land rose against him and besieged him in Akkad. He survived. The empire held. But the pattern was set. Akkadian power rested ultimately on military supremacy and the personal charisma of the king, not on the deep institutional legitimacy that temple traditions had once provided to city-state rulers. When the king weakened, the periphery stirred. Sargon's sons Rimush and Manishtushu each ruled after him, each facing immediate revolt upon succession, each suppressing it with recorded brutality. The empire's center held through violence and administrative competence, through the redistribution of conquered land to loyal followers, through the systematic integration of trade routes that funneled wealth toward Akkad. A new artistic style emerges, naturalistic, powerful, depicting the human body with muscular precision unknown in earlier Sumerian art. Cylinder seals show mythological combat scenes rendered with fluid dynamism. The bronze head found at Nineveh, whether depicting Sargon or a successor, gazes outward with calm imperial authority, its braided hair and trimmed beard expressing a new ideal of kingship, not the humble servant of the gods, but something approaching divinity itself. But that bronze gaze belongs to a world already crumbling. Within a generation of Naram-Sin's death around 2218 before the Common Era, the Akkadian Empire fractures beyond repair. Drought parches the northern rain-fed provinces. Gutian raiders from the Zagros highlands descend upon weakened garrisons. Provincial governors declare independence. The city of Akkad itself, never located by modern archaeology, vanishes from the historical record so completely that later Mesopotamian tradition treats its disappearance as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's hubris. For roughly 60 years, the Gutians exercise loose dominion over parts of Sumer and Akkad, though southern cities like Lagash under its governor Gudea maintain considerable autonomy, building temples and commissioning diorite statues of remarkable craftsmanship. The liberation comes from Uruk. Around 2120 before the Common Era, Utu-Hagal, king of Uruk, defeats the last Gutian ruler and briefly reunifies the south. But it is his former governor, Ur-Nammu, who seizes power around 2112 and establishes the third dynasty of Ur, inaugurating what later ages will recognize as the final flowering of Sumerian civilization. Ur-Nammu builds. The great ziggurat of Ur rises from the flat alluvial plain in 3 massive stages of mud brick, its lowest platform measuring 64 meters in length and 46 in width, its corners oriented to the cardinal directions. The core is sun-dried brick. The facing is baked brick set in bitumen mortar, designed to resist the erosive rains. 3 monumental staircases converge at the first terrace, leading upward toward the temple of Nana, the moon god and patron deity of Ur. The structure dominates the sacred precinct, visible for kilometers across the surrounding farmland. a manufactured mountain in a land without natural elevations. But Ur-Nammu's legacy extends beyond architecture. He promulgates the oldest surviving law code, predating Hammurabi's by 3 centuries. Its prologue declares that he has established justice in the land, eliminated extortion, and protected the orphan and the widow. The laws themselves prescribe monetary fines rather than physical mutilation, a contrast with later codes, addressing assault, divorce, false accusation, and agricultural disputes. The king presents himself not as conqueror, but as shepherd, restoring cosmic order after the chaos of Gutian rule. Ur-Nammu dies in battle around 2095, and his son Shulgi inherits a kingdom already consolidated. Shulgi's 48-year reign transforms Ur from a regional power into a centralized bureaucratic state of extraordinary sophistication. He standardizes weights and measures across the realm. He reorganizes the calendar. He reforms the scribal curriculum, establishing schools that produce administrators trained in Sumerian literary composition, mathematics, and accounting. Royal hymns, composed in his name and possibly by his court poets, celebrate him as warrior, runner, musician, and scholar, claiming he completed the journey between Nippur and Ur, a distance of roughly 160 kilometers, in a single day. The administrative apparatus Shulgi creates generates documentation on a scale unprecedented in human history. Approximately 100,000 cuneiform tablets survive from the Ur III period, records of livestock management, labor allocation, grain distribution, textile production, and temple offerings. The Bala system rotates tax obligations among provincial governors, requiring each to supply the central temples at Nippur with specified quantities of goods during assigned months. Every sheep sheared, every bundle of reeds cut, every worker's daily ration enters the written record. Scribes at collection points tally, verify, and archive on clay that will outlast the state itself by 4,000 years. Yet this meticulous order cannot hold. Along the western frontier, Amorite-speaking semi-nomads press against the settled lands. Shulgi's successors build a wall, called the Repeller of the Amorites, stretching between the Tigris and Euphrates, but it proves insufficient against populations that filter through in small groups rather than attacking in armies. Simultaneously, the eastern frontier faces Elamite pressure from the Iranian highlands. Around 2004 before the Common Era, a combined Elamite assault overwhelms Ur's defenses. The last king, Ibbi-Sin, is carried off to Elam in chains. A lamentation composed afterward mourns the city's destruction, its temples violated, its people scattered, its cattle driven away. The weeping of Ur's goddess Ningal echoes through Sumerian literary tradition for centuries. The Third Dynasty ends, and with it, Sumerian political sovereignty disappears forever from history, though the language persists in scholarship and liturgy for another 2,000 years. The collapse of Ur leaves no vacuum, it leaves a scramble. Across southern Mesopotamia, the administrative framework of the Third Dynasty fractures into competing successor states, each claiming legitimacy through possession of ancient cult centers. Isin seizes the initiative first. Its rulers, themselves of Amorite descent, take control of Nippur and its Enlil temple, the traditional source of divine sanction for kingship, and declare themselves heirs to Ur's legacy. They compose hymns in Sumerian, maintain the old calendar, and promulgate law codes in conscious imitation of Ur-Nammu. Ishbi-Era, Isin's founder, even recovers the statue of Nana stolen by the Elamites, restoring it to Ur's violated sanctuary. But Isin cannot hold the south alone. Within decades, Larsa rises as a rival power, controlling the critical irrigation networks that feed the date groves and grain fields along the lower Euphrates. For nearly 2 centuries, from roughly 2000 to 1793 before the Common Era, these two kingdoms contest supremacy in what scholars call the Isin-Larsa period. Their wars are fought not only with bronze weapons, but with water. Diverting a canal upstream can starve a downstream city of its lifeblood. The landscape itself becomes a weapon. Meanwhile, Amorite dynasties establish themselves in cities across the Tigris-Euphrates system, at Eshnunna in the Diyala region, at Mari on the middle Euphrates, at Assur in the north, and at a modest settlement called Babylon on the Euphrates, roughly 80 kilometers south of modern Baghdad. Babylon is unremarkable at first. Its early Amorite dynasty, founded around 1994 before the Common Era, controls little territory. For 5 generations, Babylon's kings remain minor players in a crowded political landscape dominated by Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and the emerging power of Elam. Everything changes with the 6th king of that dynasty. Hammurabi ascends Babylon's throne around 1792 before the Common Era, inheriting a small kingdom surrounded by stronger neighbors. For the first 3 decades of his reign, he builds cautiously, strengthening fortifications, digging canals, dedicating temples. His correspondence, preserved on clay tablets, reveals a ruler obsessed with administrative detail, personally adjudicating disputes over fields and orchestrating the digging of waterways. He forms alliances, shifts loyalties, and waits. Then, beginning around 1764, Hammurabi strikes with devastating speed. He defeats Rim-Sin of Larsa, ending that kingdom's long dominance of the south. He turns against his former ally, Zimri-Lim of Mari, destroying that magnificent palace city on the Euphrates. Within a decade, he controls all of southern and central Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the middle Euphrates, with influence extending further north. The instrument of unification is not merely military. Hammurabi governs through law. His famous stele, a pillar of black diorite standing over 2 meters tall, carved with 282 legal provisions, beneath a relief showing the king receiving authority from Shamash, god of justice, represents not the invention of law, but its most comprehensive articulation. The code addresses property, commerce, family, labor, assault, and professional liability. A surgeon who blinds a patient loses his hand. A builder whose house collapses and kills the owner forfeits his life. Prices, wages, and rental rates are fixed. Women may own property, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and conduct business. Thousands of private letters and contracts from this era reveal a society of extraordinary commercial vitality. Merchants trade textiles and tin southward, import copper from Dilmun in the Gulf. Scribal schools, the Adaba, flourish, producing the standard literary versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis flood narrative. Mathematical tablets demonstrate sophisticated algebra, calculating square roots and solving quadratic equations. Old Babylonian is the classical age of cuneiform culture. Yet Hammurabi's empire barely outlives him. His son Samsu-iluna faces rebellion immediately. The far south breaks away permanently. Successive kings rule an ever-shrinking domain. Around 1595, before the Common Era, a Hittite army under Mursili I raids down the Euphrates, sacks Babylon, and carries off the statue of Marduk. The first dynasty of Babylon ends, not with a prolonged siege, but with a sudden, distant blow, leaving the city open to new masters from the mountains. The new masters come from the Zagros highlands, a people called the Kassetes, known in their own tongue as Kashu. They had appeared in Babylonian records decades before the Hittite raid, working as laborers and soldiers along the middle Euphrates. Now, in the vacuum left by Mursili's withdrawal, a Kassite dynasty seizes the throne of Babylon and holds it for over 4 centuries, the longest single dynasty in Mesopotamian history. Their origins remain obscure, their language preserved only in personal names and a short vocabulary list belongs to no known family. Yet they do not destroy Babylonian civilization. They adopt it. The Kassite kings take Babylonian throne names, worship Marduk and Enlil, commission cuneiform literature, and rebuild temples across the southern plain. They construct a new royal capital, Dur-Kurigalzu, modern Akar-Kuf, west of the Tigris, where a massive ziggurat rises from the flat terrain, its mud-brick core reinforced with reed matting at regular intervals, a technique visible today in the weathered stump that still stands nearly 60 meters high. Kassite Babylon becomes a stable, conservative state. The old scribal schools continue their work. Literary texts are copied, organized, and canonized. The Great Omen series Enuma Anu Enlil, compiling centuries of celestial observations, takes its standard form during this era. Babylonian medicine, mathematics, and divination are systematized into reference collections that will endure for a millennium. A distinctive Kassite innovation appears in the Kuduru, carved boundary stones of black diorite or limestone that record royal land grants. Their surfaces bear divine symbols, the crescent of Sin, the 8-pointed star of Ishtar, the horned crown of Anu, serpents and scorpions representing underworld powers. These stones mark a shift in land tenure, royal grants to loyal officials creating something approaching private estates outside the old temple economy. Far to the north, along the upper Tigris, the city of Asher undergoes its own transformation. For centuries a modest trading city, Assyria emerges as an independent military power during the 14th century before the Common Era. Under Ashur-uballit I, who reigns from approximately 1363 to 1328, Assyria breaks free from Mitanni overlordship and demands recognition as an equal of Babylon and Egypt. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found in the Egyptian pharaoh's archive, reveal this new world order. Kings address each other as brothers, exchange gold, lapis lazuli, horses, and princesses. Ashur-uballit writes to the pharaoh requesting gold, complaining about the quality of previous shipments. Babylon protests that Egypt should not treat Assyria as an equal. The protest goes unheeded. By the 13th century, Assyria has become the dominant power of Upper Mesopotamia. Tukulti-Ninurta I conquers Babylon itself around 1225, carrying off the statue of Marduk, an act of extraordinary sacrilege that Babylonian chroniclers never forgive. He builds a new capital across the river from Ashur, but his own sons murder him. The pattern of Assyro-Babylonian rivalry, military conquest followed by cultural guilt, political assassination, and Babylonian recovery, establishes itself for centuries to come. Then the wider world convulses. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the interconnected palace economies of the eastern Mediterranean collapse. The Hittite Empire vanishes, Ugarit burns, Egypt retreats behind its borders. Sea peoples ravage the Levantine coast. Yet Mesopotamia's core survives, insulated by distance from the maritime disruptions. The damage comes instead from within. Aramaean semi-nomadic groups press into the Euphrates Valley and the Jazira steppe, disrupting trade routes and isolating cities from one another. Assyria contracts. Babylon weakens under the second dynasty of Essene. One moment of recovery blazes through the darkness. Around 1110 before the Common Era, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar I marches east into Elam and recovers the stolen statue of Marduk, returning it triumphantly to Babylon. The event inspires a surge of theological literature glorifying Marduk's supremacy, seeds of the great creation epic Enuma Elish, which elevates Marduk above all other gods. But the recovery is brief. By the end of the 11th century, both Assyria and Babylon have retreated to their heartlands, surrounded by Aramaean tribes whose language, Aramaic, will slowly replace Akkadian as the spoken tongue of Mesopotamia. The old cuneiform world endures, but the demographic foundations beneath it have permanently shifted. The Aramaean tide recedes slowly. Through the 10th century before the Common Era, Assyria clings to its heartland, the triangle of cities between Ashur on the Tigris, Nineveh to the north, and Arbela to the east. The old capital at Ashur still functions, its temples maintained, its scribes copying royal inscriptions. But the empire that Tiglath-Pileser I had briefly extended to the Mediterranean has contracted to a rump state, hemmed in by Aramaean tribal confederacies occupying the Jazira steppe and the middle Euphrates. Assyrian kings of this period, Ashurabi, Ashuresh-ishi, Tiglath-Pileser II, campaign annually just to keep trade routes open and tributaries flowing. The survival is tenuous but unbroken. The recovery begins in earnest with Adad-nirari II, who reigns from 911 to 891 before the Common Era. He pushes Assyrian borders outward again, subduing Aramaean polities along the Kabur River and reasserting dominance over Babylonia through a treaty sealed by dynastic marriage. His successors Tukulti-Ninurta II and Ashur-nasirpal II inherit a state with renewed confidence and, crucially, access to iron. The Zagros foothills and Anatolian trade networks supply the ore that Assyrian smiths forge into weapons harder and cheaper than bronze. Swords, spearheads, arrowheads, and the fittings for siege machinery that will define a new era of warfare. Ashur-nasirpal II ascends the throne in 883 before the Common Era and transforms Assyria from a recovering kingdom into a predatory empire. His annals, carved in cuneiform across stone slabs lining palace walls, describe campaigns of systematic brutality, flayed skins draped over city walls, pyramids of severed heads stacked before gates, mass deportations of conquered populations. These are not merely acts of cruelty but calculated policy. Terror precedes the army. Cities surrender without siege when they learn what resistance brings. He chooses a new capital, Kalhu, the city later known as Nimrud, built on the east bank of the Tigris, south of Nineveh. The northwest palace rises there, an enormous complex of courtyards, throne rooms, and residential quarters, its walls lined with carved gypsum panels depicting the king hunting lions, crossing rivers on inflated skins, receiving tribute, and presiding over siege warfare. Colossal winged bulls with human heads, lamassu, guard the doorways, each carved from a single block of stone weighing tens of tons. At the palace's inauguration, Ashurnasirpal hosts a banquet for 69,574 guests over 10 days, an event he commemorates in a stele listing the quantities of meat, bread, beer, and wine consumed. His son Shalmaneser III inherits this military machine and campaigns for 35 years, from 858 to 824 before the Common Era. He pushes west into Syria, where at Karkar in 853 he meets a coalition of 12 kings, including Ahab of Israel and Hadadezer of Damascus, commanding combined forces that temporarily halt Assyrian expansion. The battle is indecisive, but Shalmaneser returns repeatedly, grinding down resistance. His black obelisk, a four-sided stone monument from Nimrud, depicts foreign kings prostrating themselves before him, including Jehu of Israel offering tribute. The Assyrian military system by this period operates with professional efficiency. Infantry formations deploy iron-tipped spears and shields. Cavalry, replacing the older chariot corps for rapid pursuit, rides without stirrups but with devastating effectiveness. Siege engineers construct ramps, battering rams housed in armored frames, and mobile towers. Sappers tunnel beneath walls. Archers provide covering fire from behind wicker shields. Conquered populations are deported en masse, not randomly, but strategically resettled to break ethnic solidarity and provide labor where the empire needs it. Yet after Shalmaneser's death, Assyria enters a long decline. Civil war between his sons weakens central authority. Provincial governors accumulate autonomous power. For nearly a century, from roughly 820 to 745 before the Common Era, Assyria stagnates, its army still formidable, but its campaigns limited, its treasury strained, its periphery restive. Urartu to the north grows into a rival power. The empire awaits a reformer who will reimagine its entire administrative structure, and that figure, Tiglath-Pileser III, is already stirring within the military hierarchy, preparing to seize the throne and rebuild the machine from its foundations. In 745, before the Common Era, a military officer seizes the Assyrian throne, possibly through coup, certainly through force of will. Tiglath-Pileser III inherits a stagnant empire and immediately dismantles its administrative architecture to rebuild something unprecedented in scale and efficiency. The old system of powerful provincial governors, men who had become nearly autonomous during the century of weakness, gives way to smaller provinces under directly appointed officials who answer to the king alone. Military commanders are separated from civil administrators. An intelligence network of royal agents, the Kepyu, reports directly to the palace, bypassing local hierarchies entirely. The army itself transforms. Where previous Assyrian kings relied on seasonal levies of farmer soldiers, Tiglath-Pileser creates a permanent standing force, the Kasir Sharuti, the royal cohort, supplemented by units drawn from conquered peoples. Iron weapons are now standard. Cavalry replaces chariots as the primary mobile strike force. Siege engineers travel with the army, carrying prefabricated battering rams and scaling equipment. The deportation system becomes industrial in scale, entire populations relocated across the empire to shatter resistance and redistribute labor. Between 745 and 727, Tiglath-Pileser campaigns almost without pause. He crushes Urartu's influence in Syria, annexes the Aramaean states of the west, reduces Israel to a vassal, and reasserts control over Babylon by taking its throne himself under the name Pulu. When he dies, The machine he built continues without interruption. His son Shalmaneser V besieges Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The city falls in 722, though by then Sargon II, another usurper, no blood relation to his predecessor, has claimed the throne and the credit. Sargon deports 27,000 Israelites eastward, scattering the 10 northern tribes into Assyrian territory, where they vanish from history. He then constructs an entirely new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, a planned city of geometric precision covering 300 hectares, its walls pierced by 7 gates, its palace raised on a platform overlooking the plain. The city takes a decade to build and is abandoned almost immediately after Sargon's death in battle in 705. His son Sennacherib wants nothing of his father's creation. He turns instead to ancient Nineveh, transforming it into what he calls the Palace Without Rival, a structure of at least 80 rooms, its walls lined with carved alabaster reliefs depicting his campaigns in extraordinary detail. The Lachish reliefs alone stretch across an entire room, showing the siege and fall of that Judean fortress city in 701, soldiers scaling walls, defenders tumbling, families marched into exile. That same campaign brings Sennacherib to the walls of Jerusalem, where King Hezekiah pays enormous tribute, but the city itself survives, an outcome both Assyrian and biblical sources acknowledge from radically different perspectives. Sennacherib also engineers water. The aqueduct at Jerwan, spanning a valley on massive stone arches, carries mountain water 55 kilometers to feed Nineveh's gardens and orchards. The city swells to perhaps 100,000 inhabitants within its 12-kilometer circuit wall. After Sennacherib's assassination by his own sons in 681, Esarhaddon takes the throne and accomplishes what no Mesopotamian king had achieved, the conquest of Egypt in 671, pushing Assyrian power to its absolute geographic maximum from the Nile Delta to the Iranian plateau. Yet it is Ashurbanipal, reigning from 668 to approximately 627, who represents both the zenith and the beginning of the end. A warrior who crushes Elam so thoroughly that its civilization never recovers, he is also a scholar, trained in scribal arts, able to read Sumerian, passionate about knowledge. His library at Nineveh accumulates over 30,000 tablets, literary works, medical texts, astronomical observations, ritual instructions, mathematical problems, royal correspondence. Scribes are dispatched across Babylonia to copy every text they can find. The collection preserves the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, omen series spanning centuries of observation. Palace reliefs show him hunting lions from horseback, the animals released from cages into an arena, their death agonies carved with extraordinary anatomical precision and something approaching compassion. The empire he governs stretches across the entire Fertile Crescent, administered through provinces, vassal states, and treaty obligations enforced by the ever-present threat of the army's return. Yet beneath this magnificent surface, the structure has grown brittle. Ashurbanipal's war against his own brother Shamash-Shum-Ukin, who rules Babylon as sub-king, devastates southern Mesopotamia for 4 years. The treasury empties, subject peoples watch and wait. Ashurbanipal dies around 627 before the Common Era, and the empire he held together through intellect and brutality begins to fracture with astonishing speed. The succession is contested. His sons Ashur-etil-ilani and Sin-shar-ishkun divide loyalties among the military and priesthood. Civil war erupts not at the periphery but in the heartland itself, Assyrian armies turning against Assyrian armies in the very cities that had projected terror across the known world for 2 centuries. In Babylon, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar seizes the opportunity. By 626 he controls the southern city and declares himself king, founding what later generations will call the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. His early campaigns against Assyrian garrisons in the south meet mixed success. The Assyrian military machine, even fractured, remains formidable. But Nabopolassar possesses a strategic vision that transcends battlefield tactics. He looks east toward the Zagros Mountains, where a confederation of peoples called the Medes has been consolidating under their king Cyaxares. The 2 powers share a common enemy and nothing else, no language, no culture, no gods. But hatred of Assyria proves sufficient foundation for alliance. By 615, Assyria's situation has become desperate. Sin-shar-ishkun holds Nineveh and the northern heartland, but the empire's provincial structure has collapsed. Egypt, once a subject territory, now sends troops northward to support Assyria, not from loyalty, but from fear of what might replace it. The great cities of the Assyrian triangle, Ashur, Nimrud, Nineveh, stand like islands in a rising flood. Ashur falls first. In 614, the combined Median and Babylonian forces storm the ancient religious capital, the city where Assyrian kings had been crowned for over a millennium. The temples of the god Ashur burn. The sacred precinct that had legitimized every Assyrian monarch since the 3rd millennium is reduced to rubble and ash. Then comes Nineveh. In the spring of 612 before the Common Era, the Allied armies converge on the greatest city in the world, a metropolis of perhaps 100,000 souls, protected by a 12-kilometer circuit of walls, some sections rising 25 meters high with 15 gates. The siege lasts approximately 3 months. Ancient sources and modern archaeology agree on what ends it. The Kharsa River, swollen by unusual rains, breaches a section of the mud brick wall. The attackers pour through the gap. Sin-shar-ishkun perishes. Tradition says he immolates himself in his burning palace rather than face capture. The destruction is total and deliberate. The palaces that housed Ashurbanipal's library, the carved stone reliefs depicting 2 centuries of conquest, the administrative archives of the most sophisticated bureaucracy the ancient world had known. All are buried under collapsed mud brick and fire debris. The city is never reoccupied on any significant scale. Within a generation, Greek mercenaries marching past the site will not know its name. Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar inherit the Assyrian world. At Carchemish in 605, the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar destroys the last Assyrian remnant army and its Egyptian allies, shattering Pharaoh Necho's attempt to maintain a buffer state in Syria. Nabopolassar dies that same year, and Nebuchadnezzar races home to secure the throne. He succeeds, and for 43 years he will rule the most powerful state in the Near East. Babylon becomes his monument. The city expands to cover perhaps 10 square kilometers, protected by a double wall system so massive that chariots can ride abreast along the top. The Ishtar Gate rises at the northern entrance, its facade covered in glazed bricks of deep lapis blue, decorated with rows of bulls and dragons molded in relief, their forms picked out in gold and white. The processional way stretches south from this gate, its walls lined with 60 glazed brick lions in striding profile. At the city's heart, the Etemenanki Ziggurat, the temple platform of Marduk, rises in 7 stages, its summit perhaps 90 meters above the plain. This is the structure later remembered as the Tower of Babel. In 586, Nebuchadnezzar's armies destroy Jerusalem and its temple, deporting the Judean elite to Babylon. This event, the Babylonian exile, will reshape Jewish religion and identity permanently, producing much of the Hebrew Bible as a literature of displacement and memory. Yet this empire proves ephemeral. Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562, and within 7 years 3 kings are murdered. Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king, alienates the priesthood of Marduk by favoring the moon god Sin. When Cyrus the Great of Persia approaches Babylon in 539, the city opens its gates without significant resistance. The Cyrus cylinder proclaims liberation. Independent Mesopotamian sovereignty ends, not with fire, but with silence. Beyond the rise and fall of kings, beyond the burning of cities and the carving of victory steles, there exists another Mesopotamia, one recorded not in royal inscriptions, but in the quiet accumulation of 500,000 cuneiform tablets recovered from the earth. These are the contracts, the school exercises, the beer recipes, the divorce proceedings, the medical prescriptions, and the merchant complaints that together compose the texture of ordinary existence across 2.5 millennia. The foundation of all life between the rivers is water. The Tigris and Euphrates do not flood conveniently like the Nile. They rise in spring when crops are already growing, and their channels shift unpredictably across the flat alluvial plain. Every settlement depends on canals, and every canal demands constant labor. Silt accumulates at roughly 2 centimeters per year. Without dredging, a canal becomes a raised ridge within a generation. Administrative tablets from every period record the corvée labor obligations, days owed by each household for canal maintenance, measured precisely, enforced by temple or palace authorities. A single breach can destroy an entire district's harvest. A single season of neglect can render farmland saline and barren for decades. The primary crop is barley, more salt-tolerant than wheat, which gradually disappears from southern fields after roughly 2000 before the Common Era as salinization intensifies. Date palms line every canal, providing fruit, syrup, wood, and fiber. Gardens grow onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, and lettuce in the shade of the palms. Sheep and goats graze stubble fields after harvest. The temple of Inanna at Nippur maintains flocks numbering tens of thousands, their wool production documented tablet by tablet, weight of fleece, quality grade, destination workshop. From this wool and from flax comes textile production, the largest industry in Mesopotamia after agriculture. Thousands of women and children labor in temple weaving workshops. The third period records from the city of document individual weavers by name, their daily output quotas, their rations of barley and oil. A single textile workshop might employ 300 workers producing standardized cloth for trade and tribute. Barley serves not only as food, but as currency. Workers receive rations measured in silla, roughly 1 liter. A male laborer earns 60 silla per month, a female laborer 30. Silver eventually supplements barley as a medium of exchange, weighed in shekels of approximately 8 grams, but barley remains the wage of common people throughout Mesopotamian history. and much of that barley becomes beer, the daily staple consumed by every social class. Brewing recipes survive on tablets, describing the preparation of bapir, a twice-baked barley bread fermented in water with date syrup. At least 8 varieties of beer are attested, from thin daily rations to thick ceremonial brews. Children destined for scribal careers enter the adubba, the tablet house, around age 5 or 6. They begin by learning to form wedge-shaped marks in wet clay, copying sign lists endlessly. A school exercise from Nippur preserves a student's complaint about his teacher's beatings. The curriculum progresses from sign lists to Sumerian grammar to mathematics to literary compositions. A fully trained scribe requires perhaps 12 years of education. Most students are male and from prosperous families, though female scribes are attested in the old Babylonian period, particularly among priestesses and palace administrators. Women hold property, initiate divorce, conduct business, and serve as priestesses, particularly the Naditu women of Sippar, cloistered religious women who manage substantial commercial portfolios documented in hundreds of legal texts. Hammurabi's code specifies bride prices, dowry rights, and inheritance provisions. A woman whose husband is captured in war may remarry if she lacks means of support, but must return to her first husband if he comes home. Medicine operates through 2 complementary practitioners, the ASU, who applies herbal remedies and poultices, and the Ashipu, who diagnoses through divination and treats through incantation. A therapeutic text might prescribe grinding juniper berries with rendered fat, binding the mixture to the patient's temple, and reciting a specific prayer to the healing goddess Gula. Disease is understood simultaneously as physical affliction and spiritual contamination. Trade reaches extraordinary distances. Carnelian arrives from the Indus Valley. Lapis lazuli travels from the mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan. Tin comes from sources still debated, perhaps Iran, perhaps Central Asia. Copper flows from Oman, called magan in Sumerian texts. Cedar descends from Lebanon. Merchants organize in family firms, extending credit across generations, their partnerships documented in sealed contracts stored in household archives beneath clay floors. The Persian army enters Babylon in 539 before the Common Era without a battle. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, declares that Marduk himself chose Cyrus as righteous shepherd, that the Persian king restored the gods to their sanctuaries and returned deported peoples to their homes. The propaganda is deliberate, composed in the language of Babylonian royal tradition, shaped to legitimize foreign rule through native theological idiom. Babylon remains intact. Its temples continue to function. Its priests still perform the Akitu festival each spring. The great city simply acquires a new master who governs through existing structures. Under Achaemenid administration, Babylon becomes one of the empire's wealthiest satrapies. Persian kings take the title King of Babylon alongside their other designations. Darius I builds a palace on the citadel mound, its architecture blending Persian columned halls with Babylonian mud brick tradition. The Esagila temple complex, House of Marduk, receives royal patronage. Cuneiform scribes continue recording business transactions, temple accounts, and astronomical observations on clay tablets. Aramaic, written on perishable parchment and papyrus, spreads as the empire's administrative lingua franca, but Akkadian persists in sacred and scholarly contexts, a living language retreating into specialized domains. The astronomical diaries begin in earnest during this period. Systematic nightly observations recorded by temple scholars in Babylon, noting planetary positions, weather, river levels, commodity prices, and political events. These records, maintained continuously for centuries, represent the longest sustained scientific observation program in human history. Babylonian astronomers develop mathematical models of extraordinary sophistication, predicting lunar eclipses and planetary phenomena using arithmetic sequences that will not be surpassed until the European Renaissance. Alexander of Macedon defeats Darius III at Gaugamela in 331 before the Common Era and enters Babylon as conqueror. He sacrifices to Marduk, orders the restoration of the Esagila, and plans to make the city his eastern capital. In 323, he dies in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, fever consuming him over 11 days in June, his generals already maneuvering for succession as he slips from consciousness. Babylon witnesses the fracturing of the largest empire yet assembled. The Seleucid dynasty inherits Mesopotamia. Around 305 before the Common Era, Seleucus I founds a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, some 60 kilometers north of Babylon. The shift is gradual but devastating. Population drains from the ancient city toward the new Greek foundation. Babylon does not die suddenly. Its temples still operate. Cuneiform astronomical texts continue to be composed, but the city shrinks, its outer quarters abandoned, its canals silting without royal maintenance. Greek culture overlays but does not erase Mesopotamian tradition. A Greek theatre rises within Babylon's precincts. Hellenistic pottery appears alongside traditional wares. Yet in the Esagila and the Temple of Anu at Uruk, priests still copy ancient rituals in cuneiform, still train apprentices in Sumerian, a language dead for over 1,000 years, preserved like Latin in medieval Europe as the tongue of sacred learning. Mathematical astronomy reaches its apex in the Seleucid period. Scholars at Babylon and Uruk develop the zigzag and step functions that model lunar velocity with remarkable precision. The Parthian Arsacid dynasty displaces Seleucid authority by the mid-2nd century before the Common Era. Ctesiphon, near Seleucia, becomes the new imperial seat. Babylon fades further, yet cuneiform does not vanish overnight. Temple communities maintain their traditions with diminishing resources and shrinking numbers of trained scribes. The astronomical diary tradition continues into the 1st century before the Common Era. Individual tablets, horoscopes, ritual texts, scholarly copies appear sporadically. The last datable cuneiform tablet known to modern scholarship is an astronomical almanac from Babylon, inscribed around 75 of the Common Era. It records predicted positions of planets and lunar phenomena in the same wedge-shaped script first pressed into clay over 3,000 years earlier at Uruk. Somewhere in a crumbling temple precinct, an aging scholar, perhaps the last person alive who can read these signs, sets down his reed stylus. No student waits to learn. No patron funds the work. The tradition simply ends, not with destruction but with silence, as the final keeper of the world's oldest written knowledge passes without successor into the gathering dark. For centuries after that final stylus falls silent, the cities of Mesopotamia do not vanish, they sink. Mud brick dissolves back into the earth from which it was shaped. Walls crumble inward, filling rooms with debris. Wind carries dust across abandoned courtyards. Rain compresses centuries into meters of stratified soil. What were once the greatest urban centers on Earth become tells. Flat-topped mounds rising 10, 20, 30 meters above the surrounding plain, their contours softened by millennia of erosion until they resemble natural hills. Farmers plow their fields around them. Shepherds graze flocks on their slopes. The knowledge of what lies beneath passes out of living memory entirely. Yet fragments survive through unexpected channels. Greek astronomers inherit Babylonian mathematical models, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 before the Common Era, preserves king lists and flood narratives that echo through Hellenistic scholarship. Islamic scholars of the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, working in Baghdad, built barely 90 kilometers from ancient Babylon, translate Greek texts that carry embedded Mesopotamian knowledge forward into algebra, astronomy, and medicine. The sexagesimal system persists in every clock face and navigational chart without anyone remembering its origin in Sumerian temple accounting. The physical rediscovery begins in the 1840s. Paul-Émile Botta, French consul at Mosul, digs into the mound of Khorsabad in 1843 and uncovers the palace of Sargon II, massive stone reliefs of winged bulls and battle scenes emerging from the Iraqi soil after 25 centuries of burial. 2 years later, the young Englishman Austen Henry Layard begins excavating Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, pulling from the earth the carved panels of Ashurnasirpal, II's northwest palace. The scale astonishes Europe. Entire palace walls, shipped in fragments down the Tigris on rafts, arrive at the British Museum to crowds who have never imagined such antiquity existed. Meanwhile, at the cliff face of Behistun in western Persia, Henry Rawlinson spends years between 1835 and 1847 copying and deciphering the trilingual inscription of Darius the Great, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian. His work, combined with that of Edward Hincks and Jules Oppert, cracks cuneiform open. Suddenly, the tens of thousands of clay tablets emerging from Iraqi soil become readable. In 1872, George Smith of the British Museum translates a fragment from Nineveh describing a great flood, the Gilgamesh tablet, and the world recognizes that biblical narratives have far older Mesopotamian antecedents. Through the 20th century, systematic excavation transforms understanding. Leonard Woolley's work at Ur between 1922 and 1934 reveals the royal tombs, the Great Ziggurat, and entire residential quarters. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, founded in 1926, becomes custodian of an incomparable collection: cylinder seals, gold jewelry, cuneiform archives, the Waka vase, the copper Besetki statue. Then comes devastation. In April 2003, during the invasion of Iraq, the museum is looted. Approximately 15,000 objects disappear in days. Archaeological sites across southern Iraq, Umma, Isin, Lhasa, are cratered by illegal digging. Satellite imagery shows thousands of pits scarring ancient mounds. Climate change accelerates damage as drought desiccates marshlands and salt crystallization destroys exposed mud brick. Yet recovery continues, objects are returned, sites receive UNESCO World Heritage designation, Iraqi and international teams resume excavation. Today, over 500,000 cuneiform tablets sit in museums from Baghdad to Philadelphia to Berlin, many still unread. The tales of Iraq hold compressed within them the full record of humanity's first experiment in urban complexity. Law, literature, mathematics, astronomy, bureaucracy, empire. Every hour divided into 60 minutes, every circle measured in 360 degrees, every legal code claiming authority from written precedent carries forward the invisible inheritance of those reed-filled plains where, 6,000 years ago, scattered farmers first imagined something larger than a village and built it from river mud and ambition. Thank you for joining this journey through the world's first civilizations. If these stories of the land between two rivers have deepened your understanding of where our world began, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new exploration of history's greatest stories.